Hi, so I'm going to be explaining my Unit 6 take-home test. So question 1. Suplectopia produces a very specific automobile called Suplec cars. Although they help you get from point A to point B in a jiffy, they cause pollution runoff to seep into local waterways. These cars are produced in an imperfectly competitive industry. Part A. Draw a correctly labeled graph of the car market and show each of the following. So here's my graph. I included marginal social cost, marginal private cost, demand. You would not include marginal private benefit or marginal social benefit because this graph and situation is a negative externality because it has a negative result. So only the costs would be included on the graph. The market equilibrium would be where demand and marginal product cost intersect. The social optimal quantity would be where demand and marginal social costs intersect. Part B says, assume the government decides to impose a lump sum tax or subsidy. What will happen to the socially optimal quantity? Explain. I said if the government decides to impose a lump sum tax, the firm's average fixed cost would increase, meaning that average total cost also would increase. However, it would have no effect on marginal cost, so the lump sum tax would be ineffective and not change the socially optimal point because the socially optimal point is where price equals marginal cost. Part C says, assume instead of a lump sum tax or subsidy, the government decides to impose a per unit tax or subsidy. Explain whether a per unit tax or subsidy would be effective. If so, how would the government determine the value of the per unit tax or subsidy? If not, explain. I said a per unit tax would be effective. This would work because it would slow down the production of cars, because with more output being produced, there would be more taxes producers would have to pay. This means more money to, produce cars. The value of this can be determined by looking at the marginal product cost and the marginal social cost. So by taking the difference between these two curves at a certain quantity, the value could be determined. On your graph in Part A, indicate if there is a new market equilibrium quantity labeled Qn. If not, explain. I said there would be a new equilibrium because price would increase and quantity would decrease because of the new tax on production. And then lastly, what will happen to deadweight loss? Explain. I said deadweight loss would be eliminated because the gap between the marginal product cost and the marginal social cost would be eliminated because of the per unit tax, as we see. So there would no longer be deadweight loss. Okay, question 2 says, Don's Body Shop hires workers in a perfectly competitive factor market for unskilled labor. Part A, using a correctly labeled side-by-side graph for the labor market in Don's Body Shop, show each of the following. So I have these two graphs. There we go. One is the market graph, so we have a downward sloping demand curve and an upward sloping supply curve. And where they intersect is the quantity equilibrium and the wage equilibrium for that graph. And then the firm, since it's perfectly competitive, we have a horizontal slope. A horizontal curve for supply, and then we still have a downward sloping demand. And then QR and WR would be where these two curves intersect. Part B says, is the marginal factor cost of unskilled labor for Don's Body Shop greater than, less than, or equal to WE? Explain. Or equilibrium wage. I said the marginal factor cost of Don's Body Shop would be equal to the wage equilibrium. Since Don's Body Shop is a perfectly competitive factor market, it would be a wage taker, so it really has no say in what the wages would be. So like transferring from the market to the firm, they would be exactly the same because it has to take what the market gives. Part C says, now assume that the government imposes an effective minimum wage for unskilled labor. Show the minimum wage on your graphs in Part A labeled W min. So we have our new minimum wage, which is higher than our other wage because it's more effective and benefits workers more. And then on the labor market graph in Part A, show the quantity of unskilled labor supplied in the labor market as a result of the minimum wage increasing. So now we would have a new quantity supplied right there. And then 3 says, as a result of the new minimum wage, will the marginal revenue product of the last worker hired by Dawn's Body Shop increase, decrease, or stay the same, and explain? I said, as a result of the new minimum wage, the marginal revenue product of the last worker will remain the same because the equation for marginal revenue product is the product price multiplied by the output. And since wage does not affect either of these, it would not affect the MRP. Okay. Lastly, question 3, provide and explain an example of a private good and a public good. I said an example of a private good is a can of soda because it is excludable and rival. That means you can prevent people from getting it. And also there's like rivalry within that good. An example of a public good are public roads and highways because they're non-excludable. Anyone can use them and they're non-rival because there's not other industries for this. There's like only the government can provide it. B, explain how the government would regulate each of the following for a monopoly. So the point of fair returns is where price equals average total cost. So the government could regulate this point by changing the prices that a monopoly can charge by imposing price ceilings, which would prevent them from industries charging as much as they might have been in the past. The social optimal point in a monopoly is where price equals marginal cost. So the government could regulate this point again by placing a price ceiling that would alter the overall price. And my favorite moment of class has been watching like all the fun videos at the beginning of class and like everyone trying to figure out a way that they relate to topics we've talked about. I feel like that was a really fun way to like, I don't know, have a break from like just content, but also bring in content too. I don't know. It's like the best of both worlds. I feel like that's been like one of the highlights, and just having like class discussions and getting to know everyone better. So yeah, thank you.